These are 5 terrifying true stories, which were carefully submitted by real nurses, patients, and hospital staff from all over the country. Story 5 is the shocking tale that 2 different nurses submitted, completely independently, from 2 very different and distant hospitals. Before we dive deep into the horror, make sure you hit that subscribe button right now so you never miss an update. You will want to see the terrifying secrets we have uncovered from the darkest, most haunted corners of hospitals around the entire world. We will begin our countdown with the 5th story, which is a chilling account from a quiet night shift at a hospital. A first-year ICU nurse named Sarah was working the overnight rotation alone inside a small, remarkably quiet rural hospital in the woods. At exactly 2 o'clock in the morning on a quiet Tuesday, Sarah received a sudden, unexpected patient admission from the emergency room. The elderly man was named William Chun, a 78-year-old patient who was found completely unresponsive inside his locked suburban home. Sarah carefully wheeled the elderly man into room 12, which was the isolated corner room at the end of the long hallway. As the fluorescent lights hummed overhead, Sarah quietly monitored his vitals and documented everything, thinking it was just a typical night. However, the young nurse quickly noticed something extremely odd and unsettling written in the margins of the elderly man's official medical charts. The messy and frantic handwriting simply warned, "Do not let this man wake up alone, because someone must always be watching him." Sarah asked the tired emergency room nurse about the strange handwriting, but the woman looked completely confused by the chilling, frantic message. The transfer nurse insisted that absolutely nobody on her team had written those creepy warnings on the patient's medical records tonight. Trying to shake off the deep dread creeping up her spine, Sarah returned to the dim nurse's station to finish her electronic charting. The unit was completely silent, except for the rhythmic, distant beeping of cardiac monitors echoing loudly down the dark, empty corridors. At exactly 3 in the morning, the red call light for room 12 suddenly illuminated, breaking the silence of the station. When Sarah stepped inside the room, she saw that Mr. Chin remained completely unconscious, his breathing steady on the automated ventilator. Yet, the nurse saw the plastic call button resting on the mattress, its small red LED light glowing brightly in the dark. Mr. Chen's hands were completely motionless at his sides, making it physically impossible for him to have pressed the emergency alert. Assuming it was just an equipment malfunction in the old building, Sarah quickly reset the light and returned to her desk. But only 15 minutes later, the call light for room 12 flashed on again, glowing a persistent, eerie red on her monitor. When Sarah stepped inside the patient's room this second time, she immediately noticed that the ambient air had grown freezing cold. The temperature had dropped so drastically that her warm breath began to visibly mist in the icy air of the cubicle. Underneath the steady hum of the mechanical ventilator, a faint, terrifyingly cold whisper began to drift through the silent room. The invisible voice seemed to come from everywhere at once, repeatedly murmuring the same chilling words. "Do not let him wake up." Sarah's hands trembled with extreme fear as she slowly backed toward the dark doorway, keeping her eyes locked onto the motionless patient. The disembodied whispering grew slightly louder and more desperate, echoing in her ears, even though Mr. Chen's vital signs remained perfectly stable. Panicking, Sarah hurried back to the desk and called Patricia, her experienced supervising nurse, who rushed up to the floor immediately. But the moment both anxious nurses crossed the threshold back into room 12, the mysterious, terrifying whispering stopped entirely, leaving only heavy silence. The temperature had returned to normal, and Patricia looked at her young colleague, wondering if she was cracking under shift stress. However, Patricia's gaze suddenly caught something unusual on the far wall that made her experienced face pale with absolute shock. The dry erase whiteboard, which neither of them had touched, now displayed a freshly written, frantic message scrawled in messy black marker. The chilling words on the whiteboard matched the chart margins perfectly, reading, "He killed us. Do not let him wake up." Patricia quickly pulled up Mr. Chen's deep medical history on the dark nursing terminal, searching the digital archives for any past admissions. What the veteran supervisor uncovered in those dusty, old digital files made both of the nurses' blood run cold with absolute dread. Exactly 10 years earlier, Mr. Chen was admitted to this hospital after his wife and daughter tragically died at home from carbon monoxide poisoning. He was the sole survivor of the tragedy, found unconscious on the floor by local firefighters who responded to the emergency. Although authorities investigated the incident as a potential murder-suicide, the state eventually ruled it an accidental death from a faulty heater. The legal case was officially closed, and the tragic, mysterious deaths of his family members simply became another forgotten community misfortune. But while reading the ancient nursing notes, Patricia discovered that previous night shift staff had experienced identical hauntings in his room. 10 years ago, other nurses had reported sudden, unexplained cold spots, whispering voices, and major equipment failures around this same patient. One caregiver had officially documented an overwhelming, heavy sensation of dread, feeling as though something invisible was watching her every move. Because of this dark, terrifying presence, she refused to enter his hospital room unless she was accompanied by another staff member. Sarah and Patricia stood close together in the empty, brightly lit corridor, quietly whispering about their next course of action. They could not report supernatural activity to the on-call physicians, yet they could not ignore the chilling, impossible messages on the wall. They decided to transfer Mr. Chun to another room immediately, using a fake excuse about faulty medical equipment to justify it. As they began disconnecting his monitors, the overhead lights started flickering violently, and the loud cardiac alarm began to scream wildly. Next, the life support ventilator began to alarm, though Sarah verified that all the pressures and air hoses were completely secure. There was absolutely no mechanical explanation for the shrill, deafening warning beep that now echoed through the deserted, dark intensive care unit. Just as Patricia reached out to silence the screaming, flashing machine, the elderly patient's eyes suddenly snapped open, wide and staring directly at her. Sarah's stomach dropped instantly as she gazed into those old eyes, recognizing an ancient, dark awareness staring back through his wrinkled features. The frail old man sat up with eerie, fluid grace, a movement far too smooth for someone who had been deeply comatose. He smiled hideously, and when he spoke, his voice was a deep, multi-layered chorus of different people speaking through his throat. The terrifying, multi-tone voice slowly rasped Sarah's name, even though she had never introduced herself to the patient during his brief stay. His mouth stretched open wider than was anatomically possible, releasing a low, unnatural sound that made their hair stand on end. The sound was a hollow, distorted laughter, resembling freezing winter wind blowing through an abandoned graveyard mixed with distant, weeping children. While Patricia frantically pressed the blue staff emergency button, Sarah stood entirely frozen under the weight of his dark, piercing gaze. Though officially listed as completely nonverbal, the entity began reciting deeply personal secrets about Sarah's childhood that nobody else could possibly know. He spoke of her family secrets and a long-buried car accident, revealing private truths she had never shared with another living soul. Suddenly, the hallway lights began flickering in a rapid, sequential line, drawing closer and closer to room 12 like an approaching presence. Every single monitor in the intensive care unit began to scream at once, creating a chaotic, deafening symphony of mechanical alarms. Patricia grabbed Sarah's arm, dragging her backward to break the terrifying trance and escape into the comparative safety of the hallway. But Mr. Chen instantly stood blocking the only exit, his loose hospital gown fluttering as medical tubes trailed behind like grasping tentacles. Sarah gasped in horror as she noticed the patient's bare feet hovering an impossible half-inch above the cold, polished linoleum floor. The entity tilted its head at an extreme, sickening angle that should have instantly snapped the old man's fragile neck vertebrae. The entity slowly asked the nurses where they thought they were, its multi-toned voice vibrating with layers of ancient, terrifying significance. It whispered that the hospital was built on ancient ground, where an older force had waited patiently beneath modern medical science. With trembling hands, Patricia reached into her scrub pocket and frantically pulled out a preloaded chemical sedative syringe to defend them. She knew deep down that normal medicine would not stop this demon, but she desperately needed to regain control of this nightmare. As Patricia lunged forward with the chemical sedative, the possessed patient lunged out with unnatural, blinding speed, grabbing her wrist tightly. His freezing, iron grip was so powerful that Patricia's bones creaked, causing her to drop the syringe onto the cold floor. Suddenly, the dark entity released her wrist, and Mr. Chen collapsed onto the hard tiles with a heavy, human groan. Instantly, the flashing lights stabilized, the noisy alarms fell completely silent, and the freezing room temperature returned to a comfortable warmth. When the morning staff arrived 20 minutes later, they discovered both nurses huddled in the staff break room, pale and shaking. Since the patient was back in bed resting peacefully, the incoming charge nurse assumed they had just run a difficult resuscitation. Mr. Chen passed away peacefully 2 days later, surrounded by his family, while Sarah immediately requested a permanent day shift transfer. When they later reviewed the digital security footage from that terrifying night, they discovered all the corridor cameras had malfunctioned simultaneously. The entire video timeline was obscured by heavy gray static, except for a single, terrifying frame buried deep within the interference. The frame revealed a tall, shadowy silhouette standing directly behind Mr. Chen's reflection, something that was definitely not a human being. That is the fifth story, which was submitted completely independently by two unrelated nurses working in entirely different states and hospitals. When we contacted them to verify their experiences, neither woman had any idea that the other nurse's identical account even existed. Hospitals are unique places where the thin, fragile veil separating life and death is known to wear incredibly thin by design. During the quietest hours of the night, nurses report that something occasionally passes back from the other side into our world. These terrifying accounts were shared by real medical professionals who bravely risked their clinical reputations to tell us the absolute truth. These dedicated doctors and nurses work in the rational world of science, yet they occasionally confront things that defy all explanation. If you work in the healthcare field, you likely harbor an unsettling story of your own that you keep carefully hidden. But late at night, when you are walking down those empty hallways alone, you will find yourself walking faster past certain rooms. Thank you for watching, and if you managed to finish this video without keeping your lights on, you are very brave. Please share your own unexplainable hospital experiences in the comments below, and always remember to check on your night shift nurses.